Okay, welcome back. We're about to start the last kind of like proper kind of research session, which will be a relatively long one. Before we before we have the panel debate at the end of the day. So as in the previous sessions, this session is around one theme, which is climate change, natural resources and conflict, which is the theme that Juan and me are responsible for. We kind of agreed that I would do the presentation, but I'm still extremely grateful for Juan to be here, in front for moral support. Okay, so in this topic, it wasn't entirely obvious from the start, why we would combine these two topics, given that both of them are extremely important topics of research and risk factors of conflict in particular. But I think that while we were thinking about what priorities were for research in this area, it became more and more clear to us that these two areas are actually very closely linked. And I think that will also become clear throughout this presentation. So if we think about the effect, the relationship between climate change and conflict, I would say that this is actually one area in which there has been a tremendous amount of research activity, and also already kind of some stylized facts that are well established. These stylized facts in this literature, again with some exceptions of course, I'm looking at Mathieu, who wrote one paper that goes a bit against this consensus, but I think there is across a set of papers and settings, there is now a very convincing and big body of evidence showing that extreme weather events, be it exceptional droughts, be it high temperatures, be it flood destruction, cause conflict. And there have been meta studies on this topic. I'm quoting a few of those, all kind of reaching this conclusion. Also, in terms of the mechanisms of influence, we have quite a lot of evidence already on what the channels could be through which these extreme weather events affect conflict outcomes. The most obvious one, which is relatively well documented, is that areas that are hit by extreme shocks, they suffer a loss of economic livelihoods, which essentially lower the opportunity cost of participating in conflict. So that's the so-called opportunity cost channel, and this has been documented in a number of settings. I quote a few papers here, but these quotes are not exhaustive. And one of the tricky parts of presenting this type of overviews to this audience is that some people will inevitably be insulted. But don't hesitate to get in touch if you think that you've been overlooked. Uwe already did this this morning, which is why he's on the slide very prominently. But so also other mechanisms that could be quite important here is that climate shocks may exacerbate conflict between different groups by activating some kind of a rapacity channel, where if a group is less hit than a neighboring group, that neighboring group may actually have an incentive to access land and create tensions with other groups, and these channels could be reinforced by climate shocks. So through that channel, climate shocks could actually activate a channel that is quite similar to what in the literature has been called a rapacity channel. This channel is also related to what is sometimes studied separately as water disputes. So these are disputes over access to water, and there has been some very nice recent work as well showing that these that these water disputes are drivers of conflict. Another channel through which climate shocks could affect conflict is through displacement. So if people are hit by extreme weather events, they may be forced to move, and by moving, they may generate tensions in their new destinations. This is a channel that is often discussed but on which we actually don't have that much evidence, which is something I'll come back to later. Very importantly in this literature as well, and I'm sorry, this like it's almost a laundry list, but it's just to show like how much activity there has already been on this topic in the literature. But very prominently as well in the literature, there is this idea that there may be just direct behavioral effects of extreme weather on conflict outcomes. In particular, we have like quite a lot of papers showing that extreme weather events generate violence even in settings where a direct economic channel is very unlikely to operate. So we know that people like are more likely to beat up referees in American sports games when the temperatures are high, right? And if these channels exist in those settings, they probably exist in the kind of like, low income country settings as well that we study. And they could obviously coexist with these economic challenges that perhaps as economists are more central to our thinking. On top of that, there has been work like, linking climate shocks to regime stability. And at a global level, you can also think that climate change and climate shocks ultimately feed into global prices, which have been shown in the work of Owen to also like be important risk factors for conflict. So this is just a broad overview, making the point, and this is by no means exhaustive, but it's just making the point that like in terms of mechanisms, we have like there's already quite a lot of evidence out there like showing specific channels through which weather shocks can affect conflict. And I think studying these mechanisms is obviously crucial as researchers, because this is ultimately also how we will be able to understand like how these weather shocks are going to affect conflict outcomes in specific contexts, right? So depending on the exact conflict context, the mechanism that's going to be activated will probably be different. In spite of the large body of literature already on these topics, we think that there are still some channels that are a bit understudied. Those include like displacement, as I mentioned earlier, and I think Uwe already mentioned this in his presentation. The link between climate shocks, migration, and conflict is something that's very present in the policy debate, but on which actually we don't have that much evidence yet. Similarly, like another channel that is a bit understudied is the role of biodiversity. So a lot of this work is about like these extreme weather shocks, but an important impact of climate change will also be on biodiversity. And we don't know yet very well how this interacts with conflict dynamics. And similarly, and again here there's a bit of an overlap with Uwe's presentation, but the impact of climate change and climate shocks on the disease environment and on conflict through that channel is another area that we think deserves more research in the future. Taking a step back, because so far we've been focused mostly on the impact of climate shocks on conflict, but taking a step back, we can also think that conflict affects the natural environment, and in particular that conflict can contribute to environmental degradation. There has been some work by Juan in particular on this topic, but probably not nearly enough. More broadly, another extremely important question from a policy perspective is to try to aggregate the evidence that we have accumulated on the impact of climate shocks to something that we can use to understand climate change, which involves moving towards more of a prediction approach. And this is not something that's trivial, right? Because the historical shocks that we've studied are probably going to be quite different from the accumulation of extreme weather events that are linked to climate change, and the longer term trends in terms of changes in climatic conditions that are going to be caused by long run climate change. And so a key question therefore is how we can use the existing data and evidence to better simulate the effects of longer-term climate change. Again, there has already been some work on this topic by Dominic and co-authors in particular, but we think that this is again another very important area for future research. And then finally, on the topic of climate change, like particularly important as well, of course, are policy interventions that try to break this nexus between climate shocks and conflict. And so there has been some work on exactly on this topic. So there has been very interesting work on like how a social protection program through public employment in India seems to mitigate and actually eliminate the climate shock and conflict link. There's also like super interesting work that's going to be presented in this very session. So I won't talk about that at all, about crop and well, in this case, cattle insurance. But more broadly, we can also think that there could be policies that that are focused on adaptation rather than in insurance. Again, this is something on which we don't have that much evidence. I think one of the most convincing existing papers is actually on the adaptation and the adoption of sweet potato in historical China. But it's something that that of course can be studied in contemporaneous settings as well, and that is very kind of relevant for policy interventions and for agricultural extension. And finally, in the literature, there's also this idea that political institutions and the design of political institutions can help to mitigate some of these climate impacts. But again, we don't think that this. I mean, we think that this is an area on which there's a lot of scope for further research. So this kind of sums up what we think are kind of key priorities for research on climate change and conflict. I'm now going to turn to the second sub-theme of our theme, which is the one of natural resources. And there's an interesting parallel here in the sense that I would also say that this is an area where the literature has been very active and has established, again, something that's pretty much a stylized fact by now, which is the idea that mineral resource wealth tends to spur conflict. So there is a very strong relationship that has been established in a variety of settings between mining mineral price booms and conflict. Similarly, the discovery of big oil deposits also seems to spur conflict. And in terms of the mechanisms, again, there has been already quite a lot of there are quite a lot of channels that have already been documented very convincingly in the literature. So to start with, the kind of the seminal work on this topic by Juan, showing essentially that price booms in oil price booms in Colombia contribute to violence through the generation of local rents that can be appropriated by different conflict actors. And so it seems in another seminal paper by Mathieu and co-authors that this is a similar channel that operates in sub-Saharan Africa. More recent work has really emphasized how also the economic structure of natural resource extraction could matter for how these for where these impacts are stronger and how exactly they operate. And so the work of Raúl Sanchez Lachera and Anouk, who's also going to present later in this session, is very relevant here as well. And so if you think about economic structure, particularly important as well is our artisanal mining, where actually there is some evidence out there that this is a setting where in some cases the opportunity cost channel may actually dominate, because artisanal mining, unlike kind of more capital intensive mining activity, actually generates employment activities and economic benefits that may offset the rapacity channels that operate in other settings. Again, the literature has highlighted a set of additional factors. So geographical features, the exact location of deposits could also play a role in how strong this conflict inducing effect actually is. There's also interesting work on like how firms and politicians benefit from like the interaction between resource extraction and conflict. And there's also very rich like recent work on like how natural resource extraction interacts with political processes in conflict settings. So again, on this topic, like, in spite of the fact that we already have like a lot of evidence on the existence of particular mechanisms, we think that this research is very important. It needs to be continued, because it's only by understanding these mechanisms that we can, like, get a sense of like which will be the channels that dominate in particular contexts. And again, here we think there are some channels that are understudied a bit in the literature. These include here pollution. So we actually know that mining activity, especially in poor countries, tends to come with a lot of like environmental damage. This could also interact and create conflict processes, which have not really been documented until now. And as for like climate impacts, like natural resource extraction is also like often like linked to migration processes. It can attract migrants who come to work in these sectors. But environmental degradation may also lead to out-migration, and these are like movements that again we may think have an impact on conflict outcomes, but that have not really been studied in the literature yet. If we take a more broader view, I think that like also the role of like, again, I'm repeating myself here a bit, but like biodiversity and natural capital in a broader sense deserves a bit more attention, because the literature has been focused a lot on mining resources, but not on the broader set of like, natural resources like forests and biodiversity that could have potentially different impacts. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later in this session myself. Again, the parallel with like climate change is quite strong here, because we think that like here as well, there's an important like kind of forward-looking question that needs to be answered, which is how we can think about the existing historical evidence to understand the changes that are going to be happening in this sector as part of the green transition, right? We know that the green transition, if it continues as perhaps anticipated a couple of years ago, but we think that this will actually generate like very sharp demand shocks in the future for specific minerals. And there is a key question of like, how the historical evidence allows us to think about these future shocks, because they may be different in nature. And this is again why, like, and where understanding the context and the exact mechanisms is going to be particularly important. The oil sector as well plays a special role in the green transition, because it's a contributor to climate change, but also affected directly by these changes. And to kind of keep the analogy complete, so we think that in this area as well, there's like some like interesting initial evidence in terms of policy interventions. Like one area that has been studied a lot already, and on which we have like a good body of evidence, is the role of international regulation and transparency initiatives. So there are at least 10 papers like thinking about like how international regulation can actually mitigate the conflict impact of mineral resource extraction. The evidence is actually quite mixed on these impacts. There are some papers saying that these transparency initiatives reduce conflict. There are other papers that say that they lead to more conflict. There's clearly some scope here for like works that tries to reconcile these different findings. But one area that has been relatively understudied is actually the role of domestic regulation as opposed to international initiatives. Domestic regulation is obviously going to be a function of state capacity, which is in part why like international regulation is often seen as the key tool to intervene in this sector. But at the same time, it may still be that there are important policy tools that can still be used in this area, and these have been understudied. One particular kind of domestic intervention that could be quite powerful is linked to like political institutions. So there's some recent work by Timo Fetzer and Kibors showing that like power sharing in Nigeria can actually weaken the impact of oil price shocks on conflict. And I have actually some work myself on India where we show that like royalties, mineral royalties flowing to state level governments actually contribute to conflict dynamics, which points to the fact that these royalty institutions can be an important policy tool in this area. But again, we think that there's quite a lot of scope for future research here. So to conclude, and I think I probably went a bit over time, but I'll try to compensate for that later in my my last talks. But to conclude, we think that on these in these two areas, there's really a large body of literature already. There is an emerging consensus on some stylized facts. There's quite a lot of evidence already on mechanisms, but there are in each case there are some specific channels on which we definitely need more evidence, and we also need all of that is going to be contributing hopefully to a concerted effort where we try to understand, in a more forward-looking way, what the impacts will be of climate change and the green transition, and also to help us inform about specific and concrete policies that can help to break these conflict cycles, either between extreme weather events and conflict, or between natural resource extraction and conflict. And so, as I already mentioned, the papers in this session are highly relevant for this topic, and I think we can therefore transition to the papers right away. The first one is by Anouk.
This paper is called Pitting Against Each Other. It's a joint work with Tarek Ghani, Juan Lozano, and Jake Shapiro. So it's a paper on mining and conflict. Why should you care? So to fight climate change, the world is going to need a lot more minerals. Minerals such as graphite, lithium, cobalt that we're using in things such as batteries, electric car batteries, solar panels, windmills. And the World Bank predicts that demand for such minerals will increase by nearly 500% in the next decades. So we need a lot more minerals. So the policy question is really, where is this all going to come from? And who is going to dominate the supply chain? And is the answer to that question going to be China? So thinking first about where these minerals are going to come from, some of these might come from recycling, etc., but a lot of them are going to come from new mining. So there are two forms of mining. There's large-scale mining and there's artisanal and small-scale mining. And we see over time a large increase in the number of people who practice artisanal and small-scale mining. So that's mining by individuals or small-scale groups with little to no technology. So we now estimate there's over 40 million people worldwide who are artisanal miners. That's 90% of all miners worldwide. So in terms of employment, artisanal mining dominates large-scale mining by a large percentage. And artisanal mining also produces a relatively large share of production. Now, estimates are very uncertain and fluctuate a lot, but between 2000 and 2020, anywhere between 6 to 40% of cobalt, the main ingredient in electric car batteries, was mined by artisanal miners. This could be a problem, because we know from all the studies that Oliver has cited that there is an association between mining and violent conflict. But to also speak with Oliver, mechanisms are crucial, and the main mechanisms that we know so far revolve around rapacity, so conflict involving government and or rebels, and conflict over the revenue from mines. So we're not saying that doesn't happen, but we're also saying it can't be the whole story. So let's look at all mines in Africa. These are all the mines that had conflict around them. These are the red dots. So if we focus on those, if the rapacity mechanisms was really the only story, we would expect all these mines to be in conflict zones where rebels and governments are actually fighting. But actually that's not the case. The red dots are just as likely to be in a conflict zone as outside of them. So there's clearly also something else going on. Also, the type of violence around mines isn't exactly the type of violence that one would expect, not exclusively, if this was only a story about conflict, rapacity, conflict between government and rebels. Actually, that accounts only for, say, 20 to 25% of violence, but a lot of the violence is either riots or violence against civilians. So there needs to be some other story here. So we propose a new mechanism that contributes to the association between mining and violent conflict, which is competition between industrial and artisanal miners. And we abbreviate that as LSM-ASM conflict. What does ASM-LSM conflict look like when it's at home? It looks like this. So these are the artisanal miners that I was speaking about. And this is a large-scale mine. And they're trying to mine the same deposit. That obviously leads to competition. And we argue that that competition can become violent. How did we even think this was a thing? So we did a comparative case study on 6 mines total in the DRC and Zimbabwe in cooperation with International Crisis Group. And their artisanal industrial mining conflict was a key driver of conflict. But of course, 6 mining sites are only 6 mining sites. We want to know whether this holds in a large end setting. For that, we have to know where there is artisanal mining. We know that for very select areas, but not for the whole continent of Africa. So therefore, we train a machine learning algorithm to predict the suitability of an area to artisanal mining. And this also has the advantage of being based on geology, things like age of the bedrock, type of stone, electromagnetism of the bedrock. So we can expect this to be exogenous to conflict. So we enter our measure of the suitability for artisanal mining in sort of a now standard, made standard by the people in this room, specification of the effect of commodity price shocks on conflict. So we see that as the commodity price increases, the increase in probability of conflict is 3 times as large in cells where LSM and ASM can compete compared to in cells with only a large-scale mine. So if we do a back-of-the-envelope calculation, between 31 and 55% of the observed conflict around mines could be ascribed to large-scale artisanal mining conflict. And, perhaps important for policy, we can see that this effect is even larger for firms that are subject to less scrutiny. So this suggests some of these new policy options that, again, Oliver was asking for, that could mitigate conflict between large-scale and small-scale miners. So one would be to have artisanal mining zones, where artisanal miners that are dedicated to artisanal mining, greater firm scrutiny, but there might also be scope for large-scale and artisanal miners to cooperate. So we'll see. All right, so let me quickly move on to our case studies, which gave us our idea that large-scale artisanal miner conflict could matter to violence. So we selected 3 mines in the DRC. These are copper cobalt mines, and 3 gold mines in Zimbabwe. So they're in roughly the same area. They mine the same mineral, but they've experienced very different outcomes in terms of violence. Some have experienced no violence, some infrequent, and some frequent violence. So the question is really what explains this variation. So in our case studies, the mines that have violence around them, a lot of this violence could be traced back to LSM-ASM competition. This is a still from a YouTube video where the Congolese army is moving into a large copper cobalt mine where there are up to thousands of artisanal miners present, and they're forcibly evicting them. This is fairly typical. Usually, this is the start of a cycle of violence where then artisanal miners are violently protesting lack of access, where they regain access to the mining site, usually by bribing the security forces, and then the security forces swoop in again to evict them again, etc., etc. So it's a cycle of violence. So LSM-ASM competition can explain some of the variation across mining sites. For instance, our one entirely peaceful mine, the copper cobalt deposits there are so deep underground that artisanal miners can't get at them. So there's no LSM-ASM competition and no violence. In Giant, which is a gold mine in Zimbabwe, there was actually active cooperation between the large-scale miner and artisanal mining, where the large-scale mining company subcontracted to an artisanal mining cooperative. So conflict, the potential for conflict was there, but it was managed. It can also explain some of the variation over time. In Luwishiwishi, the mine that we just saw a picture of, initially, the initial mine owner wouldn't provide any livelihood options for artisanal miners, but then ownership changed, and the new large-scale mining company allowed miners to mine their slacks, so the refuse, essentially, and that provided a livelihood option, and conflict decreased. In these mines in Zimbabwe, there was clear government interference that helped either artisanal or industrial miners. At Gaika, a local politician essentially told artisanal miners that police wouldn't interfere if they were to encroach on a mining site. And Jumbo was forced out of business by the Zimbabwean government, and artisanal miners swept in. Then ownership changed to a businessman who was very sympathetic to the government, and then the police went in and kicked all the artisanal miners out of the mine. So we can see that this violence varies with mineral price, because a higher mineral price means greater incentives for artisanal miners to encroach, but also greater incentives for large-scale miner companies to keep them out. It may increase the volume of artisanal miners, and, such as in the case of Giant, it may lead to breakdown of prior bargains. So this one mine where competition was managed, when the gold price increased, the large-scale mining company essentially canceled the subcontract with the artisanal miners. Okay, so from this case study, we hypothesized that an increase in the international price of a commodity will lead to a greater increase in the probability of violence around an industrial mine if that mine is also suitable for artisanal mining, compared to industrial mining sites where their artisanal mining is not possible. So now the only thing we need to do is measure artisanal mining. This is very tricky. Because of data availability, we just don't know where artisanal mines are. But also, artisanal mining may be endogenous to violence. So there's lots of violence that may attract artisanal mining, or it may scare them off. But we now also know that to some extent, this violence can be manipulated by government and by companies. So what is helpful here that artisanal mining can be predicted using geology. This is an example for gold, but this story also holds for the 3 T minerals, so tin, tungsten, tantalum, and the 2 C minerals, which is copper, cobalt. So this is a stylized representation of the geology of different gold deposits. So this is the same mineral, gold, but it can be found at different depths. This is at surface level. If I'm an artisanal miner, I can get at this. This is between 5 and 10 kilometers underneath the surface. Nobody can dig this deep. So this is suitable for artisanal mining, this isn't. And you can see here there are certain geological regularities around it. The type of stone, the age of the bedrock, the presence of shears, which are fault lines, etc. So we have data, comprehensive data across the continent of Africa on these geological features. And we have artisanal mining data for some areas, in DRC and Tanzania specifically, and in Burkina Faso. So we're going to use this data and this data to train an algorithm, and then use that algorithm to predict out to the entire continent of Africa. And we're going to do this in 25 by 25 degree grid cells, which is 27 kilometers at the equator. For 4 commodities frequently mined using artisanal mining, I already mentioned them. We're training a random forest classifier with a 2-step cross-validation because we want our algorithm to be able to predict out of latitude. And we're doing this 50 times and taking the modal prediction. So this is what it looks like. We have our data on artisanal mines. We set 50% aside as a test set that the algorithm will never see. Then for the remainder, we take a random latitude and split the sample again. And then with what we left, we split the sample again. We train our algorithm here. We train 5 algorithms. We pick the one that predicts in the same latitude best. Then we pick the one that predicts out of latitude best. Again, training 50 algorithms. And then we test how well that predicts on the test set. So how well does it predict on the test set? So for gold, we're at 73% accuracy, and for all the other commodities, we're above 93% accuracy. So we can accurately predict artisanal mining using geology. In terms of the other data, I think I'm using the same stuff that a lot of people here have used. So ACLAD as the dependent variable. Then I'm using industrial mining, basically the SNL metals and minerals mining data, which is the successor to the mining data that Dominic and Mathieu have used, and data on commodity prices. So this is the standard specification that everyone used. As the price increases of a mineral, does violence go up in areas where there is a large-scale mine? And the only thing that we do is we add ASM suitability to this equation. So as the price goes up, what happens to violence in areas with an artisanal mine, with an industrial mine only, with an artisanal mine only, and in an area where we have both? So if artisanal industrial mining competition is a thing, we would expect beta 2 to be positive and large. And we have cell fixed effects, country year fixed effects, and Conley standard errors. So some sanity check first. Does LSM and ASM actually overlap at scale? Yes, it does. In 51% of cells with an industrial mine, they are also suitable for artisanal mining. Do the two mine the same mineral? Yes, they do. 91% the same modal mineral, or 94% the same any mineral. And we can also see, just as a descriptive, that the probability of conflict is higher in cells with overlap. So the probability of conflict is 7.8% in cells with an industrial. Oh, this is the wrong way around, actually. It's 7.8% in cells with an industrial mine only, and then 9.1% in cells with both. And that difference is statistically significant. So then the actual results. So we replicate the standard result in the literature that as the price of a mineral increases, we see a greater increase in, an increase in violence in areas with a mine. But if we add our full interaction model, we can see that the effect of an increase in price in areas with both LSM and ASM is 3 times as large as in areas with a mine only. This coefficient plus this one. That holds in cells where we have both types of mining. It's unsure what price assigned to the cell. Is it the price of the modal mineral that large-scale mining mines or artisanal mining mines? Doesn't really matter for the conclusion. And we can also see that this effect is concentrated in cells where LSM and ASM mine the same mineral, which is also what we would expect. We do a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation. And we conclude that LSM and ASM conflict may explain between 31 and 55% of variation in violence in large-scale mining cells. So our model predicts this many over 36,000 conflict cell years with an industrial mine, and 55% of them are also suitable for artisanal mining. Now, of course, we can ascribe that whole effect to LSM-ASM conflict, but industrial mining might also have a conflict-inducing event on its own. So if we account for that, we end up at 31% of violence in LSM scales explained by competition between large-scale and small-scale miners. This is not the same for every type of mine owner. So this conflict-inducing effect is stronger for mine owners that are subject to less scrutiny. What might provide scrutiny? A company might be publicly owned, so shareholders might scrutinize it. It might be registered in a tax haven, which would suggest little scrutiny. It might be a local firm. International firms are subject to scrutiny locally and in the country that they're registered, but local firms only in one. Chinese firms are alleged to be subject to less scrutiny. And then the OECD runs a due diligence scheme for mining, OECD +9, which might provide more scrutiny. So the ownership data on the company level is often missing, which is why we are controlling for that. But what we really want to be looking at is comparing this coefficient, sort of the baseline effect, with this interaction term, which indicates a firm subject or more or less subject to scrutiny. So we can see that if a firm is publicly owned, the conflict-inducing effect is about a half times less, but is not statistically significant. The conflict-inducing effect more than doubles if a firm is registered in a tax haven, but again, not statistically significant. It triples if a firm is local. It almost quadruples if a firm is Chinese. And the OECD conflict due diligence scheme does seem to work in canceling out the conflict-inducing effect of a price increase. So lots of robustness checks, heterogeneity, including on the endogeneity of commodity prices and the machine learning approach. Ask me about it if you want to know. But let me just conclude that we argue that industrial and artisanal mining competition helps explain the association between mining and violent conflict. 3 times as much conflict in a cell with both types of mining compared to a cell with only large-scale mining, and explains a large share of the variation in observed conflict around mines, and that local and Chinese firms are associated with more LSM-ASM conflict. So this leaves us with some alternative policy options. We might provide more and better scrutiny. We might provide designated artisanal mining areas where conflict between large-scale and small-scale miners isn't possible. However, these artisanal mining areas, at least in the DRC, tend to be located either in areas where there's no minerals or there's a lot of overgrowth, and artisanal miners frequently cannot afford the investment of clearing the site. So this might not be the silver bullet solution that it seems. And then we might also address barriers to LSM and ASM cooperation. So a lot of firms seem to be willing to subcontract because they don't mine their entire concession at the same time. They're very large. One of our case study mines is the size of metropolitan London, so the firm couldn't physically mine all of it at once. So a lot of firms seem to be willing to subcontract, but artisanal mining has a terrible reputation. It photographs terribly whenever it's in the newspapers. It's people covered in mud slaving away. So there's a large reputational risk for firms at the moment because people are very aware of the downsides of artisanal mining and very unaware of the potential livelihood impacts. So a little preview. Taking a step back again from this study, it would seem like Oliver was suggesting that if we want to fight climate change and we want to mine more green minerals, at some point we are facing a trade-off between wanting to fight climate change and potentially causing negative externalities in low-income countries. So in ongoing work, I actually have an experiment in the field right now to see how consumers of electric cars respond to this trade-off between this positive environmental externality and possible negative social externality. So stay tuned, and thank you for listening. I have no idea how I'm doing for time. Is there time for questions, or do you want to move on?
Yeah, I think we can have 2 questions.
Okay.
This is just a small clarification question. Like in one table you show, I saw that you have a log ASM price. Does that mean you have the price of the local artisanal? Yeah, this one. Like
Yes.
Does that mean you have the price of the local artisanal mining? I just wonder what is.
I wish. No, sadly, no.
Okay.
This is just to say, so we assign the price of the modal commodity in the cell to the cell. But of course, there's a modal commodity that is mined by the large-scale miners and a modal commodity that's mined by the small-scale artisanal miners, right? Often that's the same, right? In 91% of cases, it's the same, but also in 6% of cases, it differs. So that's the difference. No, I wish I had local prices of minerals.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting presentation. I had 2 quick questions. Did you see anecdotal evidence in your case studies of competing land use with other use than artisanal mining? Also thinking about earlier presentation this morning, would that trigger conflict also? And then on the policy implication in cooperation, how do income from artisanal mining compare with wage of people working in the industrial mines?
With people working where, sorry?
For the industrial mines.
Right. So 2 questions. Your first question was
other
competing land uses in our case studies. No, but that doesn't mean much because we were studying areas under license by an industrial mine. So in a way, that land was already licensed for industrial mining, and artisanal miners were competing to use it. And no, there wasn't a third competitor for the land use, but it doesn't mean that artisanal mining doesn't compete with other land use elsewhere. And then how does the wage in the local and artisanal mining sector compare? Good question. I don't know, because it tends to not be the same people. People don't tend to be artisanal miners, switch between working for a large-scale mining company and being artisanal miners. These large-scale mines provide very little employment. And where they do provide employment, in the DRC, they tended to recruit from nearby urban areas. So people living in the mine were actually quite upset that there was no local employment. But that employment, in their perception, needed to be really local. It needed to be from the villages adjacent to the mine and not from the province capital. And they were actually aggrieved about that too.
Okay, yes, not substitute. Thanks.
Hi. Just a question on the timing. So here all the time variation comes from the price, I guess.
Yes.
So you don't have entry of, or maybe try to understand where artisanal mining happens. Is it, how do they identify where the earth is rich on resources? So do they follow large scale mines? Or so do you have any idea of those timing issues?
Yeah. So we don't have time varying information on artisanal mines because it's predicted by geology. For industry, we notionally have it from the SNL minerals database, but we don't trust it at all. We looked at satellite imagery, and when the mine switches on, there seems to be no change. So we don't trust it. Plus, it's endogenous. But in terms of who comes first, the large scale, the small scale miners. In the DRC, the large scale mine was opened in the 70s. Then it was vacant for a really long period of time. So then artisanal miners were mining there for decades. And then at the end of the Congo War, the large scale mine came back. In Zimbabwe, a lot of the mines are actually from colonial times, so it's known for a long time that it was there. I think this is where East Africa and Southern Africa differ somewhat from West Africa, because in places like Niger, where gold's been more recently, in Burkina Faso also, where minerals have been more recently discovered, it was the artisanal miners that came first. And now the government is trying to convert artisanal mining sites to industrial mining sites. So, yeah, in my view, there's a difference here between East and West Africa.
It would be interesting to see if the onset of conflict depends on that, right?
Yeah, we could try it. Yeah, well, we could at least see if there's heterogeneous effects by West or East African countries. Yeah, we'll try that.